Hello and welcome to this bite-sized recording focused on feedback from the Chief Examiner reports from the Summer 2025 Digital Support Services T-Level. This video will identify key themes arising from the occupational specialism assessments, cybersecurity, network cabling, digital infrastructure and digital support. This session will focus on identifying the strengths and areas for development for each of the occupational specialisms. We'll start with cybersecurity, then move on to network cabling and digital infrastructure, and then finally digital support. We'll also consider teaching strategies aligning with the areas for development that may help to support your students going forward. We'll start by looking at the OS cybersecurity. We'll investigate the strengths, areas, development and suggested teaching strategies. Firstly, we'll take a look at the key strengths arising from the cybersecurity occupational specialism. So starting with assignment 1. In task 1, which was the software research and proposal, most students carried out research into the required software products. Stronger students made clear contextualised recommendations and justifications, and some demonstrated understanding of legal implications and access control requirements. In task 2, the installation and configuration evidence, students could perform installations successfully, and stronger students documented each stage with clear commentary and screenshots. Moving on to assignment 2. In task 1, which was investigation and remedial actions, students identified and investigated issues effectively, and there was a good understanding of remedial actions and their preventative effects. In task 2, which was the ongoing network and system maintenance, most students suggested a range of recommendations. Stronger students structured responses around software, policies, training and upgrades. And also stronger students gave contextualised recommendations with clear justifications. And then on assignment 3, for task 1, the risk assessment, students could identify physical, technical and administrative risks. Stronger students gave detailed justifications and mitigation strategies. And on task 2, around information security policy controls, students understood the need for controls and frameworks. Higher achievers made links between controls and frameworks. And on task 3, the disaster recovery plan, students generally created logical recovery plans. Stronger students produced detailed, costed and structured plans. And now we look at some of the areas identified as needing improvement for the cybersecurity occupational specialism. So assignment 1, for task 1, the software research and proposal. Weaker responses missed sections or lacked depth in comparisons, and there was a limited discussion of legal and security requirements. Access control recommendations were often missing or generic, and time management issues prevented completion of all elements. In task 2, the installation and configuration evidence, some students didn't evidence the full process, only outcomes, and there was missing commentary explaining why steps were taken. Now looking at assignment 2, in task 1, the investigation and remedial actions, some focused only on malware or software, not both. There was an inconsistent depth of discussion, and there was weakness in considering impacts across different operating systems. Some confusion between task 1C and task 2 content occurred. In task 2, there were ongoing network and system maintenance section. There was weak contextualisation to the scenario and missing key recommendations such as training or policy updates. And then in assignment 3, for task 1, the risk assessment, there was limited depth due to covering too many risks superficially, and some lacked balance across the 3 risk categories. For task 2, information security policy controls, some were missing relevant controls, and there were limited explanation of frameworks application to the scenario. There was weak coverage of policy updates and of incident management. And then in task 3, the disaster recovery plan, many did not link recommendations to the 24-hour recovery requirement. There was underuse of the provided budget, so make sure to prompt students to use the budget sensibly and even fact in the cost of downtime in justifications. And there was also missing timelines or phased recovery steps. And this slide will outline some suggested teaching strategies to support with the cybersecurity occupational specialism. So starting with assignment 1, while students did show good product research skills overall, many lost marks by not linking their findings to the organisation's specific needs. A good strategy for this would be to use a structured comparison grid with things like features, pros and cons, legalities, security and access control, and then add a paragraph that justifies each choice in context. You could incorporate mini case studies for applying legislation, for example GDPR, to real scenarios, and scaffold research using a research planning template identifying key comparison factors. Also run short timed proposal writing exercises to help them complete every section. Encourage a show and tell approach, so students document every key step with a screenshot and short explanation, and use checklists for installation evidence, for example installation step, screenshot and explanation. You could also use model exemplar evidence packs so students can see what good looks like. And then for assignment 2, so here students did tend to investigate well, but tended to go deeper on one possible cause and therefore skipping the other. So to strengthen this, you could use a 2-column template so that they can directly compare software and malware issues side by side. Provide scenario-based comparisons to encourage cross-platform thinking, for example, how a phishing attack might behave differently in Windows and Linux. Teach task decoding, so breaking down assessment instructions carefully, and also practice structuring investigations using flow diagrams or tables to plan depth. To strengthen the linking back to the company situation, you could use real company policies as examples for contextualization and create group tasks to cost out different security solutions. Encourage peel writing structure, which is point, evidence, explain and link for justifications. And then for assignment 3, so here students understood risk assessment principles but often listed too many risks too briefly. So shift the focus to prioritising, for example, selecting the top 5 and explaining them thoroughly. Using a risk matrix could help students justify their ratings clearly, and practice risk scenario ranking, so deciding which are worth expanding on. Students often didn't explain how security frameworks apply to a company, so you could use policy writing workshops with checklists and encourage the mapping of ISO controls to sections of a real security policy. Then get students to rewrite one section to explain how it would manage the incidents, and practice so what analysis strategies, for example, how each control would manage an incident. Students planned recovery actions well, but didn't always relate them to the 24-hour target. So introduce timeline mapping so they can visualise when each step happens, and use Gantt charts for recovery actions. Also, introduce mock budget exercises to help them practice allocating resources effectively. And then finally, analysing real-world disaster recovery case studies can help understand constraints and help with relating to the real world of work. Now we move on to look at the network cabling occupational specialism. We'll start by looking at the key strengths from the network cabling OS assessments. So looking at assignment 1, in task 1, the physical network design proposal, most students produced a clear cabling diagram and network design, and higher performing students considered data types and security needs, and there was an increase in use of contextual information from the business scenario. In task 2, which was a network build in Packet Tracer, students generally created functional networks, and high-performing students included all components and demonstrated working configurations. Annotated screenshots and commentary improved clarity. And then moving on to assignment 2. So task 1, the installation of cabling and security protocols. Most students successfully installed required cabling elements. Stronger students provided clear annotated evidence showing step-by-step processes. There was improved photographic evidence quality and annotation compared to last series. And then in task 2, the test plan and troubleshooting, most students could test data transmission successfully, and higher performers used varied testing methods and documented results. And then looking at assignment 3, so task 1, the cable troubleshooting. Students could identify and repair cable faults, and there was some clear photographic evidence included. For task 2, the network troubleshooting in Packet Tracer, students identified and fixed most network issues. Stronger students submitted both before and after Packet Tracer files, and there were clear step-by-step test plans which demonstrated understanding. And then in task 3, which was the risk assessment of the client's network, students identified relevant business risks and proposed mitigations. Higher performing students provided contextualised specific solutions. And now we move on to the areas for development for the occupational specialism in network cabling. So again, starting with assignment 1. In task 1, the physical network design proposal, some students missed or only briefly covered certain design requirements. There was a limited application of business needs and layout considerations, and also incomplete justification for security and access decisions. In task 2, the network build in Packet Tracer, some networks were incomplete or partially functioning, and there were missing devices or security measures from task 1. There was also a limited application of multiple security considerations, and some evidence lacked justification or sufficient annotation. Then in assignment 2, so task 1, the installation of cabling and security protocols, there were some missing steps in installation evidence and a limited range of security protocols shown. In some cases, there was poor photographic clarity and a lack of visible PPE use and explanation of PPE relevance to safety standards. And then in task 2, the test plan and troubleshooting, there was an over-reliance on 1 or 2 tests which were repeated multiple times, or brief test plans lacking detail or troubleshooting depth. So you need to remind students to consider the tools used, the standard met and expected versus actual outcomes. And then in assignment 3, so in task 1, the cable troubleshooting, there was missing or poor quality evidence, so for example blurry or incomplete photos, a lack of step-by-step documentation for each cable, and some missing final test results for all 5 cables. In task 2, the network troubleshooting in Packet Tracer, there was missing final functioning Packet Tracer files in some cases, and some students only partially resolved the network issues. There were some shallow test plan explanations, so for example what and whys of fixes were missing, and an over-reliance on all green lights as a sign of success rather than full network efficiency. And then in task 3, the risk assessment of the client's network, there was some generic risk lists with limited business-specific context. Some students covered too many risks briefly rather than a few in depth. And there was limited explanation of how the solutions would reduce each risk. And here are some suggested teaching strategies to improve outcomes for the network cabling occupational specialism. So for assignment 1, students are producing good diagrams but not always explaining their design choices in context. You could strengthen this by using network design templates that require explicit coverage of elements such as data type, layout, wired or wireless balance and security. And embed scenario-based activities where every design decision must be justified and linked to a business need. A checklist could help ensure students cover all required areas. Encourage peer reviews and visual verbal pairing, for example, where every diagram must be accompanied by a short written rationale. Practice build and verify cycles so students develop a habit of documenting, for example with a screenshot and annotation, every change they make and testing it before moving on. and use troubleshooting challenges in Packet Tracer to practice debugging incomplete networks. Security layer exercises where students need to configure and evidence at least 2 security measures will also help with their understanding, and you could model how to write short commentary paragraphs explaining what was done and why. For assignment 2, it's encouraging to see improved photographic evidence, but students are still losing marks for unclear images and missing PPE documentation. You could build evidence-taking practice into lessons, for example, using evidence capture checklists, things like before, during and after photographs for each stage, and demonstrate good photographic practice, things like angles, focus, background and lighting. Incorporate PPE reflection sheets where students state what PPE they used and why, and use peer feedback on the clarity of photographic evidence and annotations. In terms of testing, students often completed just 1 or 2 types of test which limited their evidence. So expand their toolkit by introducing a menu of different testing methods and their purposes, and require each plan to reference at least 3. You could model writing full test plans with sections for tools used, expected results and outcomes, and use troubleshooting journals so students can show the steps they took to fix issues, and include links to industry standards in their test plan templates. Then for assignment 3, technically students can fix cables, but without clear photographic evidence it's impossible to reward that skill. Standardise how students evidence faults and fixes. For example, you could use cable fault stations where students practice identifying and photographing each repair, and each must have a labelled photo, description and test result. You could run workshops on how to take clear assessor-ready photos and encourage the use of peer assessment checklists to check things like clarity of evidence. Use before and after templates to encourage students to become accustomed to submitting both the original and repaired file so that progression is visible to the assessors. You could also run diagnostic drills focusing on less obvious issues like non-critical device errors, and encourage reflection tasks on how each fix improved the performance or efficiency. Many students listed too many risks too briefly, losing depth and context. So focus on prioritization, so practice depth over breadth by picking 3 high-impact risks and exploring each fully using the cause-consequence control model. Also practice linking risks directly to client needs in realistic case studies. And now we'll have a look at the digital infrastructure occupational specialism. So firstly, we'll have a look at the key strengths arising from the digital infrastructure occupational specialism assessments. So starting with assignment 1. Task 1, which was the project plan and annotated floor plan, there were some excellent detailed Gantt charts including project overviews, and a clear identification of threats and appropriate countermeasures, some with multiple countermeasures. There was also a good use of annotation keys and visual detail in high and marked floor plans. For task 2, the research application, students demonstrated solid technical understanding and research capability. And then in task 3, the research evidence and evaluation, most students included screenshots or print screens of their research, and a clear evidence trail supported examiner validation. In assignment 2, for task 1, the installation evidence, there was a high success rate. Many students achieved full marks. There were clear step-by-step photographic evidence from many learners. And then in task 2, the user groups and access control, students demonstrated understanding of access control concepts. Then moving on to assignment 3, so the task 1, which was the risk identification and floor plan, there was a strong understanding of GDPR and data protection, and a clear awareness of data security concepts. And then in task 2, around policies and legislation, there was high marks overall for identifying and describing company policies, and clear written communication was evident. And then in task 3, the disaster recovery and business continuity section, students generally understood recovery concepts. In task 4, the action plan, there was high achievement overall, with most students submitting 10 or more actions. And now we'll have a look at some of the areas for development arising from the digital infrastructure occupational specialism. So again, starting with assignment 1. So task 1, the project plan and annotated floor plan. Some students submitted only a written overview, not a Gantt chart. Floor plans were inconsistently completed or lacked sufficient detail, and some failed to link threat, countermeasures and floor plan elements effectively to the scenario. In task 2, the research application, research responses were often generic and lacked focus on the scenario context. There was limited evidence of critical thinking or evaluation of information sources. And in task 3, the research evidence and evaluation, there was missing or insufficient screenshots from some students and limited evaluation of the reliability and relevance of sources. In assignment 2, for task 1, the installation evidence, some students provided excessive evidence. 4 well-chosen photos would suffice. There was an overinvestment of time in this low-mark task, which reduced available time for task 2. Then in task 2, which was around user groups and access control, there were some incomplete tasks, so some sections left blank. There were missing or over-redacted screenshots preventing verification. And in cases there was no evidence of user group access testing. And clearly some technical difficulties and time management issues reduced performance. Then in assignment 3, for the task 1, risk identification and floor plan, there was an over-focus on GDPR and therefore insufficient coverage of physical and technical risks. Floor plans were often poorly linked to the risk management plan. For task 2, around policies and legislation, policies were not consistently linked to the relevant legislation or laws. In task 3, the disaster recovery and business continuity, there was a weak understanding of physical measures, things like backups, alarms, hot, warm or cold sites, and limited scenario linkage in the written responses. And then task 4, the action plan. Some actions were too general, so they lacked explanation or scenario relevance, and there was a limited justification of the importance of each action. And now we move on to some suggested teaching strategies for the digital infrastructure occupational specialism. So starting with assignment 1, it was acknowledged that students demonstrated strong planning skills through well-developed Gantt charts and structured threat analysis. However, marks were lost where floor plans were missing, incomplete or lacked detail. To access higher marks, students need to produce floor plans with clear keys, precise annotations and a strong link to their risk management plan. So to help with this, you could try the following. Exemplar walkthroughs, so students compare high and low marking floor plans and discuss why detail and linkage matter. You could use annotation workshops to practice adding annotation keys and aligning them to the project scenario. And use checklists before submission of tasks, so students could think about things like, do I have a Gantt, a threat, countermeasures, annotated floor plan with key. And this would be useful during mock assessments. Also, students do understand the technical concepts but need to go beyond knowledge recall. High mark answers apply research directly to the client scenario and show critical thinking. So to practice this, do things like scenario mapping practice, where you give students a short scenario and ask how each research finding applies directly. You could use critical thinking stems, providing prompts such as this approach is suitable because, or an alternative approach could be, and use compare and justify tasks where students need to evaluate two sources and decide which best fits the client's context. Around screenshots and evaluating sources, the students who scored significantly higher were those where evidence could be verified by the assessor. So an evidence audit exercise may help, where students review examples and decide whether the evidence is verifiable or incomplete. And use peer validation so students can cross-check each other's research logs for clarity and completeness. Now moving on to assignment 2. Students generally performed very well in this practical task. However, many overspent time here, providing far more evidence than required. So think about practicing the 4-photo rule task, where students can capture 4 meaningful images, for example, a setup, configuration, a test and result. You could do timed practice runs where you simulate assignment conditions to encourage efficient evidence capture. And consider mark weight awareness, so reinforce with students how to prioritise time based on mark allocation. On this assignment, task 2 was the most challenging section, with students not completing all requirements and there being some time management issues for the most technical demanding parts. The following activities may help with this. So access control simulations, so doing things like short repeatable exercises, setting and testing permissions with screenshots. Evidence clarity workshops where students need to demonstrate what constitutes verifiable versus unclear screenshots. Again, you could do time-boxed mock tasks where you assign specific time limits per section to practice pacing, and use checklists of required evidence where students need to verify all screenshots and user account confirmations are included. And now moving on to assignment 3. Here students showed a good understanding of GDPR but neglected wider physical and technical risks. Assessments need to be comprehensive and consider things like building layout, cabling and technical failures as well as data issues. So to help with this, you could use risk categorization matrices where students would sort risks into physical, technical and data categories. And model annotated floor plans, so discuss how annotations link directly to specific risks. You could use scenario what-if drills where you pose different incidents, such as power failure or cable damage, for students to identify preventative measures. In terms of organisational policies, students could write confidently about these, but often missed linking them to legislation. So a policy to law mapping chart could help with this, where students match common IT policies to legislative sources. You could also try because of the law writing frames. For example, this policy exists because under the Data Protection Act, etc. Many students confused business continuity with disaster recovery or didn't reference physical recovery processes. Demonstrating these clear differences and applying them contextually would boost marks. So the following may help with this. A comparison table activity where students define and contrast two plans with examples. Scenario response writing, so given a company crisis, students outline both recovery and continuity actions. And then although students listed plenty of actions, many didn't explain why those actions mattered for the scenario. To demonstrate understanding, students must justify the actions and describe their impact. So an action impact justification table could help with this, where you have columns for action, why it's needed, and the impact on the company. And you could use critical writing scaffolds, so provide stems such as this action is vital because, or without this the company would, to improve evaluative and critical analysis. And now finally we'll look at the feedback from the Digital Support Occupational Specialism from summer 2025. So again, we'll start with the strengths identified from the Occupational Specialism in Digital Support. So starting with assignment 1. So task 1A, around business control techniques in GDPR, students demonstrated strong understanding of business control techniques, both physical and administrative. There were clear explanations of how to operate data systems securely, and there were frequent and accurate reference to GDPR or DPA principles. And the majority achieved band 3 to 4 marks in this section. In task 1B, which was health and safety and network setup, there was good planning and risk assessment structures in terms of network design, IP schema and timescales. There was some secure and well-documented setup evidence. And then in task 2, for installing and configuring small-scale networks, there was solid evidence for installing Windows Server and creating user accounts, and successful installation of application software and drivers. There was also a good understanding of Active Directory structure. There was confident configuration of mobile devices alongside security measures. And then in task 2C, which was the installation notes, there were detailed installation notes and good identification of vulnerabilities, and also good use of technical English and formatting. And moving on to assignment 2, in task 1A, in terms of logging and prioritising job requests, students logged and prioritised job requests effectively, and an awareness of importance and timings were shown. In task 1B, which was around job requests, most students completed all 3 job requests with clear evidence. There was a strong application of practical troubleshooting and reporting. And then in task 2, which was the instructional documents and screen share videos, there were some strong written instructional guides with detailed explanations. The use of audio commentary was praised, and there was clear, technically accurate language. And now assignment 3. So in task 1, which was maintenance, infrastructure log and penetration testing, there were some detailed maintenance notes and infrastructure logs. There was good penetration test remediation logs showing analytical thinking and a sound understanding of vulnerabilities and mitigations. In task 2, which was the imaging deployment and testing section, there was some excellent performance in creating and uploading images, and a strong grasp of Windows functionality and testing terminology. And here are the areas for development arising from the digital support occupational specialism. So for assignment 1, in task 1A, which was business control techniques and GDPR, some students failed to mention the 7 principles of GDPR DPA. There was also a limited critical understanding of how each principle links to workplace scenarios. Then in task 1B, which was health and safety and network setup, there was limited coverage of full health and safety methods, things like lone working, manual handling and RIDDLE, and some students didn't connect policy or risk actions to real workplace procedures. For task 2A, around installing and configuring small-scale networks, many students missed evidence of physical or virtual network setup, and this cost them up to 3 marks. And there was also limited detail in AD creation and explanation, and often weak or missing evidence of software license management. And then in task 2, around installing and configuring software, there was a lack of detailed evidence of OS installation, things like patching or AV configuration and terminology. And some tasks were omitted entirely, for example, deployment steps were missed. Recommendations could also be more scenario specific. Now moving on to assignment 2, in task 1A, which was logging and prioritising job requests, few justified why certain jobs were prioritised, and this cost them higher marks. And in task 2, around instructional documents and screen share videos, there were missing or incomplete videos, and some students lacked access to tools such as microphone or screen capture. And then for assignment 3, in task 1, the maintenance and infrastructure log and penetration testing, some mitigation responses were vague, and there was missing evidence of all 7 vulnerabilities in some submissions. And then in task 2, the imaging deployment and testing, there was missing evidence of client login, network connectivity, image quality, and application functionality testing. And a lack of verification steps can lead to dropped marks. And now we look at some suggested teaching strategies in response to the areas for development for the digital support OS. So starting with assignment 1. Overall, students demonstrated strong technical and legislative understanding across assignment 1. However, many lost marks to incomplete evidence, particularly around physical and virtual network setup and the breadth of health and safety considerations. So future focus should be on evidencing practical work comprehensively and linking theory directly to scenario-based tasks. Some examples of this could be as follows. So use interactive hazard mapping of digital workplaces where students annotate digital floor plans. Ask learners to write and peer review a short health and safety policy section for a specific network setup. You could run lab-based network build simulations, for example in Packet Tracer, with screenshot evidence. And teach Active Directory tasks through step-by-step guided practice and peer demonstrations. You could assign a license audit mini-project where students track and manage mock software licenses, and use video tutorials where students narrate their process and make sure they focus on terminology. You could implement tech walkthroughs where peers assess completeness of configuration evidence, and use peer review rubrics to check if installation notes are detailed and scenario linked. Moving on to assignment 2, so students showed strong technical competence in practical support tasks and communication here. However, to achieve top marks, they need to justify their task prioritisation and ensure full evidence of all video demonstrations. To help develop these skills, you could introduce service desk simulation exercises where students have to justify their priorities using SLA and impact analysis, and use triage cards to discuss priority reasoning in pairs. You can model incident reporting structures such as problem, cause, resolution and verification, and include reflection logs after each simulated job request. You could provide guided recording workshops to build confidence using video tools, and scaffold with checklists for each video task to ensure all elements are demonstrated. You could also have students peer assess instructional clarity of each other's videos. And now assignment 3. So this assignment was generally well executed with students demonstrating maturity in maintenance and testing documentation. However, consistency in evidencing full processes remains an area for development. So teaching should emphasise the importance of complete audit trails and verification evidence. This could be supported by teaching penetration testing workflows using simplified vulnerability reports, for example using vulnerability, mitigation and mapping exercises. You could assign mini penetration test reports for peer review on completeness and clarity, and deliver end-to-end imaging labs where students must complete and evidence each stage. You could use prove the image checklists to confirm testing completeness, for example login, network and applications. And create mock moderation exercises where students assess their peers' image deployment evidence. So now the next few slides will highlight our support offer and additional resources which you may find useful. So remember that support doesn't stop after this session. There's a range of materials available to help you and your students. On the NCFE qualification page, you'll find the Chief Examiner reports, student exemplar work and downloadable schemes of work with free teaching materials. There are also recorded CPD sessions on our YouTube playlist, which you can revisit anytime, and all our upcoming live events are listed on the NCFE T-Level training event page. Before we finish, we'd really appreciate your feedback on this session. You can scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link to complete a very short survey. Remember, your input helps us refine our training and make sure that future sessions are as relevant and useful as possible. Thank you for your time and engagement today. I hope you leave with some clear practical strategies to support your learners in achieving their best.